Good evening, everyone. Can we stand to pray? Let us pray. Almighty God, we come to you in the name of Jesus Christ. We thank you for this time together, and we ask, as we gather here today, that you would guide the words and our actions, and may the words and actions be guided by the Holy Ghost. We thank you for this opportunity to be able to listen to our presenter. We pray that God, you would allow us to be open to what you have for us today. Bless our presenter as she makes her presentation. We ask your blessings upon all the persons who are in this room today. We ask you also, God, to bless the persons who have also joined online. Thank you for what you are going to do today. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Dr. Francis Severin, Principal, University of the West Indies Open Campus. Dr. Halima Deshong, Feature Speaker, Senior Lecturer and Head of the Institute for Gender and Development Studies, Nita Barrow Unit, University of the West Indies, Cavell Campus. Mr. Larry Lawrence, Managing Director, Grenada Cooperative Bank Limited. Mr. Roger Duncan, Manager, Customer Care, Grenada Cooperative Limited. Ms. Jacqueline Pascal, Coordinator for the National Committee for the Prevention of Child Sexual Abuse, Ministry of Social Development. Ms. Jacinta Alexis, Senior Protocol Officer, Division of Gender and Family Studies, Ministry of Social Development. Special welcome to the Bristol family, Mr. James Bristol, Ambassador Gillian Bristol, Mrs. Ruth Bristol, and other family members. Colleagues, students from the wider UWI community, St. George's University, T.A. Marshall Community College, Westmoreland School, Presentation Brothers College. Ladies and gentlemen, at the site here with us this evening and those joining us virtually, very good evening to you. The University of the West Indies Open Campus Grenada warmly welcomes you to the 7th Annual Carol Bristol Distinguished Lecture Series. This lecture series falls in line with the university's AAA strategy of aligning itself as a means of meeting the needs of the community. Our Vice-Chancellor, Professor Sir Hilary Beckles, noted, and I quote, "Universities are not established to serve themselves. They are created for the benefit of the communities in which they are located," unquote. In this vein, these lectures are held to provide a platform for the community to engage in an intellectual discourse on social, economic, political, cultural, and ecological affairs. This year, we focus our attention on gender justice. We examine gender-related violence, the matter of unpaid labor as it relates to gender, and the complexity of care. Our featured speaker this evening is Dr. Halima Deshong. We have found in Dr. Deshong the embodiment of a Caribbean intellectual, one who has studied and critiqued our gender policies, advised regional governments on gender-based violence policies and laws, served at the United Nations in this regard. We are truly grateful to her for acquiescing to our request. We wish to sincerely thank our sponsor, Grenada Cooperative Bank Limited, for partnering with us for yet another year. Grenada Cooperative Bank has made and continues to make outstanding contributions to community development in the fields of education, health, sports, social services, culture, and the environment. We look forward to your continued support in the future. This lecture series was named in honor of Mr. Carroll Bristol, QC, for his exemplary service to the University of the West Indies. For half a century, Mr. Bristol served the university, first as a tutor in the 1960s and as a member of the University of the West Indies Territorial Advisory Council and as president of the council for 15 years. His intellect, wit, benevolence, his stalwart leadership, and his indomitable spirit was an inspiration to us all. He understood the true beauty of life is to serve one's fellow man. It therefore gives me great pleasure to welcome you to this year's Carroll Bristol Distinguished Lecture Series. I now invite the manager of Grenada Cooperative Bank to say a few words. Mr. Lawrence.
Permit me to stand on the protocol that has already been established. A very pleasant good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It gives me great pleasure to be both in the physical and virtual presence among you and on behalf of Grenada Cooperative Bank Limited as we await the 7th in a series of the Carroll Bristol Distinguished Lecture. The bank is very pleased to once again be associated with this event. Support for educational development has been one of the main areas of the bank's community involvement over the years. We have always aspired to bring cultural, historical, and I dare say intellectual awareness to the community we serve, as evident by several of the activities that we sponsor and support, such as annual Carroll Bristol Distinguished Lecture Series, Grenada Bar Association's Sir Archibald Ned's Memorial Lecture, Tivoli Drum Festival, the annual SGU Knowledge Bowl Secondary School Quiz, Beverly Steele's publication, Grenada, A History of Its People, just to name a few. Being the only indigenous commercial Grenadian bank and one of the largest by asset size in the state of Grenada, we are pleased to be associated to this year's event once again, and to host Dr. Halima Deshong, researcher, author, educator, advisor, and social policy maker. As an evolving society, the myriad of complex gender-based issues, violence, and injustices admonish us as a nation and the wider Caribbean to become ever engaging, conversant, and revolutionary in our approaches and behavior to synergistically advance. Dr. Deshong possesses the scholastic marksmanship, and I repeat, Dr. Deshong possesses the scholastic marksmanship, in our opinion, that can get us to critically reimagine new pathways and applications to treat with this taboo subject matter, which is central to the evolution of our society, an exercise that fully merits the bank's continued support. On behalf of the management and staff of the Grenada Cooperative Bank Limited, I wish to extend congratulations to the University of the West Indies Open Campus for hosting yet again this year's Coop Bank-sponsored 7th Carroll Bristol Distinguished Lecture Series, and welcome home Dr. Halima Deshong. We invite everyone to enjoy this evening's lecture and discussions, which promise to be educating, enlightening, and I dare say thought-provoking. Thank you.
Dr. Halima Deshong is a senior lecturer and head of the Institute of Gender and Development Studies, Nita Barrow Unit at the University of the West Indies, Cave campus. She recently served as ambassador and second deputy permanent representative at the Permanent Mission of St. Vincent and the Grenadines to the United Nations for their just concluded tenure on the UN Security Council. Dr. Deshong is of Vincentian and former national senior and under-23 netball player who has had the distinction of serving as captain of both teams. In 2000, she was named Vincentian Sportswoman of the Year, and she was the first Vincentian to be awarded a scholarship by the government of St. Vincent and the Grenadines for service as a national athlete, and was named a Vincentian Sports Ambassador in 2014. As a recipient of this scholarship, in 2004, Halima graduated with first-class honors and was class valedictorian at the University of the West Indies, Cave campus. She received a Bachelor of Arts in History with Literatures in English. During this period, she represented St. Vincent and the Grenadines at the International Netball Federation World Netball Championship in Jamaica, and featured prominently as part of the successful Cave campus netball team during the inter-campus games, and represented the Cave netball team in the Barbados National Netball Tournament. As a Wellcome Trust Fellowship recipient, she completed a Master's of Philosophy in Social Policy and was the first graduate of Salisis Cave Hill Graduate Program. Dr. Deshong was also awarded a Commonwealth Scholarship and completed a PhD in the School of Law at the University of Manchester with a focus on sociology of gender and violence. She spent 3 years in the UK, during which she represented the University of Manchester in netball and played for the Caribbean Diaspora netball team Flavor in the Manchester Evening League and represented the Northern Thunder in the English Netball Super League. During her time in the UK, she received her Netball Empire accreditation from England's netball. As an experienced feminist researcher, she specializes in gender violence, feminist methodologies, anti-colonial feminisms, qualitative interviewing, and the analysis of talk and text. She is the co-editor of Methodologies in Caribbean Research on Gender and Sexuality, published in 2021. Her scholarly work is published in a number of journals and books. She is also a single and joint editor in 4 special issues of journals on feminist methodologies, men and masculinities, gender and sexuality, and feminism in the Caribbean. In 2015, she was a recipient of the UWI Cave Hill Campus Research Award for Outstanding Research. Dr. Deshong has advised Caribbean governments on gender-based violence policies and laws. She is the author of the St. Vincent and the Grenadines National Gender-Based Violence Action Plan and was jointly designed the HFLE curriculum for post-secondary school students in St. Vincent and the Grenadines. During her time at the United Nations, she served as St. Vincent and the Grenadines expert on women, peace and security, children and armed conflict, youth, peace and security, and the protection of civilians. She was also a lead researcher and author of the qualitative component of the UN CARICOM Caribbean Development Bank Women's Health Survey on Violence Against Women in Grenada. Dr. Deshong is also mommy to a 9-year-old son, Johanse Deshong Marshall. She believes that animating her teaching, public service, scholarship, and outreach, she sees these as a means of ensuring the ending of the effects on the complex issues of violence and inequality towards a just Caribbean levity. Ladies and gentlemen, I present Dr. Halima Deshong.
Thank you so very much, Dr. Philip Dow, for a most generous introduction. Dr. Francis Severin, Principal of the University of the West Indies Open Campus, Professor, the Most Honorable V.U. Dean Barito, Professor Emerita of the University of the West Indies, Mr. Larry Lawrence, Managing Director, Grenada Cooperative Bank Limited, Mr. Roger Duncan, Manager, Customer Care, Grenada Cooperative Bank Limited, Ms. Jacqueline Pascal, Coordinator, National Committee for the Prevention of Child Sexual Abuse, Ministry of Social Development, Housing and Community Development, Ms. Jacinta Alexis, Senior Program Officer, Division of Gender and Family Studies, Ministry of Social Development, Housing and Community Development. Special welcome to Ambassador Gillian Bristol, James Bristol, Ruth Bristol, and other members of the Bristol family, colleagues and students from the wider UWI community, St. George's University, T.A. Marisho Community College, Westmoreland School, and Presentation Brothers College, to my mom who is present here on our side, and to Dr. Wendy Grenades, my colleague and friend who is here with me as well, ladies and gentlemen at the Open Campus site, and all of you joining us virtually, good evening, peace and blessings. I am truly humbled by the honor of having been asked to deliver the 7th distinguished lecture in a series which commemorates the extraordinary contribution of Mr. Carroll Bristol, QC, to our Caribbean. As you know, Carroll Bristol assumed the presidency of a number of organizations, including the Rotary Club of Grenada, the Grenada JCs, the West Indies JCs, the Grenada Bar Association, and Grenada Sports Council. A consummate service leader whose intellect and generosity of spirit remains etched in the memory of family, friends, and colleagues alike. His leadership in law in the OECS and in service organization has bequeathed us a legacy, an urgency, and a deep sense of responsibility to craft a just Caribbean. As a member faculty of the University of the West Indies, I take very seriously the privilege of delivering this evening's lecture in celebration of the life and work of Mr. Bristol, a Caribbean citizen whose love of and service to the university and the region remain uncompromising. Thank you again for this opportunity, for this honor to mark his legacy. Permit me also to share a sincere word of gratitude to Dr. Nicole Philip Dow, Head of Site of the Open Campus, University of the West Indies in Grenada, and her entire team for your warmth, guidance, and generous invitation, and for all of your work in organizing this lecture. Dr. Philip Dow, you're such a lovely spirit. Thank you especially for making the process a smooth one. I too, like Dr. Grenade last year, expressed regret for not delivering in person. Grenada holds a special place in my heart, as you've heard. It is the first country I ever visited, and I always experience a sense of returning to my second home when I touch down in Grenada. The whole place don't shell down, but I touch down. Of course, the exigencies of our time prevented my coming home. So here we are again, virtually. I wish also to acknowledge the contribution of the 6 previous speakers in this distinguished lecture series, noting, of course, their dedication to naming and dislodging enduring legacies of a violent colonialism and pervasive inequalities, with a view of achieving meaningful transformation in the lives of Caribbean people. From the emphases on questions of gender, race, revolutions, and reparatory justice by Professor Vereen Shepherd, Ambassador Shabazz, and Professor Brian Meeks, to Wendy Grenade's 2021 provocation about how we might disrupt disruption to engineer new pathways for the region. The arc of these lectures offer critical avenues for delineating Caribbean development. I joined this tradition as a Vincentian daughter of our region with a set of politics rooted in anti-racist, anti-colonial Caribbean feminist praxis. And just permit me while I share my screen. As a means through which to foreground this evening's lecture, I begin with excerpts from Merle Collins' 1985 collection, Because the Dawn Breaks, Olive Sr.'s 2021 pandemic poems, and George Lamin's essay, Maurice Bishop Lives. Collins writes, "We speak for the same reason that the flowers bloom, that the sun sets, that the fruit ripens, because temples built to honor myths must crumble. When the dawn breaks, there's nothing you can do about your feeble bridges. When the rain falls in the mountains and swells the flow of the rivers, we speak because we dream, because we are workers, because we are peasants, because we are leaders. You see, and we were not born to be anybody's servant." Turning to Olive Sr.'s pandemic poems, in which she reflects on the escalation of gendered violence, Sr. writes, "As if the sickness outside has entered here, the fear, the choking, the gasping for breath. But no, that one is silent and invisible, named with an exit strategy. For this one, the shadow pandemic, there is only the uncertainty, the battering, the shivering, the fear, the choking, the gasping for breath, and this blocked exit." I turn now to Lamin as he reminds us that, and I quote, "The history of people's culture is first and foremost the history of that process of labor on which such culture is built, and the history of degraded labor will reflect itself in the distortions of people's cultural formation." End of quote. Collins' insistence on voicing as a radical act of self-definition, which generations of Caribbean people have always engaged, Senior's analysis of the increased intensity of gendered violence in the lives of women in times of crisis, and Lamin's reflection on the history of labor exploitation in the making of Caribbean cultural, social, political, and economic arrangements provide a critical starting point from which to explore my chosen topic, the pursuit of gender justice, violence, unpaid labor, and the complex of care. These provocations by our Caribbean literary luminaries, along with a Caribbean feminist activist scholar tradition, provide inspiration for my reflections on the pursuit of gender justice, its relevance, its intersections with the pursuit of climate, ecological, economic, and social justice. Central to Caribbean feminist organizing is a commitment to redressing unequal relations of power, which have historically disadvantaged differently located women. An important hallmark of feminist praxis in the region is in how it situates questions of inequalities experienced by various groups of Caribbean women within broader historical and geographical contexts. Earlier this month, the Regional Institute for Gender and Development Studies hosted a commemorative panel discussion to mark International Women's Day, the subject of which was to consider the insights offered by Professor the Most Honorable Udine Barito in her 2003 essay, Theorizing the Shifts from Women to Gender in Caribbean Feminist Discourse. In this essay, Barito invites us to consider the slippages and distortions of feminist analysis of the lives of women, which occurs when feminist work is reduced to a misapplication of the concept of gender. In this move to a singular focus on gender for delineating the experiences of Caribbean women, the complexity and promise of feminist analysis, as well as its wider conceptual basis, are often missed. There is also a popular tendency to reduce the analytical power of gender to a focus on differences between men and women. The global reach of Barito's theorizing on gender, Caribbean gender systems, gender relations, and gender justice provide a partial basis for my thinking on how we might prioritize the interconnected and elusive pursuit of gender, economic, climate, and social justice. Even though I amplify the focus on gender justice in this evening's lecture, I am keenly aware of how race, class, gender, and other relations of power and difference interact to produce uneven outcomes in the lives of Caribbean people, and Caribbean women in particular. However, As Caribbean people navigate the effects of multiple crises, what becomes clear are the compounding nature of said crises on those groups already made marginal in the first place. Through the prisms of gendered violence, unpaid labor and care, I argue that until we confront and redress the most egregious manifestations of legacies of violence, labor exploitation, and the gendered complexities of care that disproportionately affect women, social transformation will remain elusive. Moreover, women's ability to participate in the economy, in family and other social networks, in decision-making, and to live autonomous lives are significantly compromised in contexts where the gendered ideals of care, the gendered organization of labor, and gendered violence continue to disproportionately affect us. I also wish to suggest that these existential concerns for women connect to how persons, including women who do not conform to normative expressions of gender and sexuality, are interpolated within state, societal, and community formations. Concerns around sexual citizenship have been thoughtfully espoused by Caribbean intellectuals, and within the organizing of groups like CAISO out of Trinidad and Tobago, Groundation Grenada, and the Eastern Caribbean Alliance for Diversity and Equality. Collectively, they confront the interstices of gender and sexuality in the lives of Caribbean people and in their relations with the nation state. Thus, questions of sexual citizenship and gender expansive identity expression have always been central to an ethics of justice. By gender expansive, I refer to the ways in which for many persons, gender identity expression does not neatly conform to normative ideas about being a woman or a man. Even as I do not assume that there exists a collective commitment to the pursuit of gender justice, I urge us to think about how the weight of history, struggle, and social movements in our region press us to imagine fuller futures for all who call the Caribbean home. All who call the Caribbean home. The pursuit of gender justice requires that we complicate and confront gender in its complexity, the complications and harms that gender relations and systems produce in the lives of women and gender expansive folk, and how these might mobilize gender analytically to transform unjust social relations. It requires us to speak and act with the kind of revolutionary fervor prefigured within Caribbean radical traditions, with the intensity housed in Merle Collins's poetry, and that we do so in the knowledge that our very survival against systems of domination is in fact a revolutionary act. In 2004, Barito called on an ethics of justice to animate the state in its gender relations with women. On the surface, this cause appears reasonably enough, especially given the myriad regional and international conventions on gender equality to which Caribbean states are signatory, as well as state attempts to engage some level of gender mainstreaming. From the last 3 decades of the 20th century onward, several Caribbean community member states have become signatories to the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, CEDAW. We've signed on to the Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action, adopted some aspects of CARICOM model legislation on issues affecting women, created gender and gender-based violence policies and operational plans, developed women's and gender machineries, among other state-level commitments to redress gender inequalities. Notwithstanding these developments, gender justice remains elusive. Further, we have observed that in times of crises, there is a sharpening of uneven gender relations. The global health crisis and its attendant economic crisis, the climate crisis, the increased occurrence and intensity of natural disasters, all come with heightened levels of violence against women and girls, increased burden of care by women, for women, and reduced access to meaningful livelihoods, particularly for women. It is with this context in mind that I turn to Barito's theorizing of gender justice, where she considers the state as her key unit of analysis, and from which we can extrapolate to address broader mechanisms, arrangements, relations, and practices which inhere inequality. Barito is wary of a rights-based approach. Barito writes, and I quote, "While I want Caribbean states to recognize women's autonomy and agency in every dimension of women's lives, I underpin my arguments for this by resorting to the concept of justice, particularly gender justice, rather than the concept of rights. Women are not allowed to engage the state as full citizens without satisfying a set of qualifying conditions. Simultaneously, states assume men have a priori rights and access to the resources of the state." End of quote. Barito here is wary of a rights-based approach in which women's emancipation is reduced to an extension of privileges to women that have been traditionally associated with men, or in assigning to women that which is ideologically and materially the preserve of men, particularly privileged men. Gender justice, according to Barito, I think I'm going in the wrong direction. Gender justice, according to Barito, is, and I quote, "a societal condition in which there are no asymmetries of access to or allocations of status, power, and material resources in a society. In a gender system characterized by gender justice," she says, "there are no hierarchies of gender identities or of the meanings society gives to masculinity and femininity." End of quote. Working toward gender justice requires exposing and eliminating the injustices revealed in feminist analysis, in which women, men, and gender-expansive folk are either penalized, nor do they, according to Barito, receive undue privilege for the identities with which they clothe their biological, physiological selves. Further, her theorizing of Caribbean gender systems as inhering ideological and material dimensions in ways that are often masked in their presentations as normal and natural is applicable for exposing the operation of gender, broadly speaking. However, in societies with histories of European settler colonialism, gender never operates away from race and a range of other social relations of power and difference. In much of anti-colonial feminist writings, gender is regarded as a colonial modern institution, and as such, gender analysis in the Caribbean requires an anti-colonial reckoning with the term gender itself. Unfortunately, that is the stuff of a whole other lecture. Suffice it to say that when I engage Caribbean feminist gender analysis, I do so by complicating the operation of gender beyond the Western man-woman binary. It is against this backdrop that I turn to consider the experiences of gendered violence, unpaid labor, and the complex of care in the lives of Caribbean women, for what these experiences tell us about the impediments to and possibilities for creating just societies. In more than a decade of research on gendered violence, particularly on violence against women in intimate heterosexual relationships, I have observed that persons affected by, persons who perpetrate, and persons working to remediate the effects of violence explain these harms in ways that inhere the very dangerous gendered assumptions which produce such violence in the first place, whether in media, in interviews with women and men about men's violence against women in intimate relationships, or in interviews with state officials. Rationalizations, excuses, and explanations of gendered violence fall back on colonialist binary scripts of gender and sexuality. Ultimately, gendered violence occurs in a context where gender and sexuality intersect and are socially produced in particular times, spaces, and cultural contexts. In other words, gender and sexuality structure the context within which such violence persists. For example, Both Vincentian and Grenadian women's reports of their experience of intimate partner violence demonstrate the dominance of men's proprietary posture towards women, or put differently, how men objectify women as property in their narratives. As lead researcher on the recent qualitative component of the UN Women Caribbean Development Bank CARICOM Women's Health Survey in Grenada, I observed a number of ways in which women's overall safety and autonomy remain significantly compromised as a consequence of gendered violence by men. I also made similar observations in early research on the same in St. Vincent and the Grenadines and in Barbados. Turning to the Grenada study, however, a number of familiar trends emerge. The experience of sexual violence by an intimate partner was reported by survivors as well as in interviews with key informants as widespread. Pseudonyms are used to differentiate among participants across all studies to protect their identity. And I want to share with you just some of the narratives that emerge from that work. So here, the following is an excerpt of a dialogue with Sarah, who was 25 and unemployed at the time of the interview. And she was asked about her having experienced abuse, sexual abuse in her relationship. Her response was, well, there's a few times like we had our mishaps and, I felt very hurt and he would want, and I would say no, and he would force himself. Stories of sexual violence shared by Grenadian women are quite similar to those provided by women in other qualitative studies. For instance, Vincentian women reported that men often force or coerce them into sex, sometimes defining their experience as rape, which often occurred after they had had verbal disputes or had been victims of physical violence. However, these studies have also shown that while women disclose their experiences of sexual violence in these relationships, men who perpetrate these harms avoid implicating themselves as perpetrators of sexual violence. Tracy Robinson reminds us that in intimate relationships in the Anglophone Caribbean, these are codified in ways that reinforce hierarchies of race, gender, and sexuality, producing patriarchal and heteronormative articulations of Caribbean families. In other words, men in these studies call on antiquated legal codification of women having consented to sex in perpetuity, not only in marriage, but also in so-called marriage-like unions in the form of common law relationships. This runs counter to the recent revisions in sexual offenses legislation in some Caribbean countries, as well as the R versus R ruling in the UK, both of which outline the conditions under which rape in marriage is criminalized in law. It is of note that marital rape was criminalized in 2012 in Grenada with an amendment to the sexual offenses legislation. Men's proprietary attitude towards women, and by that I mean the ways in which men objectify women in these violent relationships as property, is recognized as a form of gendered power expressed as sexual violence in these relationships. This is supported by accounts of women like Britt, a 33-year-old administrative assistant who remarked that the bad times are probably he was addicted to sex and he disrespectful, and sometimes when he wanted it, he would fight me for it. What Britt discloses is a reality for many women who confront gendered violence in their relationships. Although she rationalizes his sexual violence as an addiction, which would imply a so-called lack of control on the part of the perpetrator, being forced into sex or rape is identified as men's attempt to exercise or assert power at the level of the relationship. This form of violence is supported by broader systems and practices of gendered power at the level of the state, institutions, and the society at large. The relationship between sexual violence against women in intimate relationships and broader systems and structures of violence is further illustrated by an example drawn from an interview with Simone, who is a counselor. This example illustrates how relations of power based on gender and sexuality operate to produce uneven outcome for women. Simone says, in the relationship, and it extends to all their decisions in their life. You know, choices of how many children to have and how often they have sex. We as women, do you have a serially? Is when he comes and he says, can you say no? I know that causes problems because once you turn them down, the first thing is, do you have someone else? They get accused of having someone else because you don't want to have sex with them. Women are often forced into unwanted sex as a means to which to prove fidelity, the effects of which sometimes results in unwanted pregnancies and sexually transmitted infections. Studies have shown that a significant proportion of women are sexually exploited and even raped by their partners as part of the wider experience of gendered violence. In a study of women who sought refuge at a shelter for battered women in Port of Spain, Trinidad and Tobago, Tracy Robinson found that 80% of them reported they were raped by an intimate partner. Similarly, 2011 data analyzed from the National Intimate Partner and Sexual Violence Survey from the US indicate that more than half of the women surveyed had been raped by an intimate partner. In Grenada, rates of intimate partner violence against women in heterosexual relationships are in keeping with world averages that indicate that 1 in 3 will experience violence in their lifetime. This is illustrated in the graph shown on your screen now. It shows the way that Grenada kind of sits at that very 1/3. You see 29% of physical and sexual violence lifetime prevalence. And what you're seeing in the taller pillars would be the prevalence at the time that the survey was administered. What you're seeing on the shorter, darker red pillars would be the lifetime prevalence. That's the other way around, actually. The lifetime prevalence are the taller pillars. The shorter pillars would be the prevalence at the time of the survey. So its prevalence exposed the normative fiction of family, intimacy, and romantic loving as inherently empowering for women and children. Rather, decades of activism against violence against women by regional feminist and women's organizations serve to expose gendered violence as the most egregious manifestation of gender inequality. It is also critical to consider how socioeconomic conditions and race figure in ways that amplify the intensity, frequency, and responses to violence. For example, Graham Dans and Sri Prasad demonstrate racialized state responses to reports of intimate partner violence by Afro and Indo-Guyanese women. A reading of this study suggests that Afro-Guyanese women were often constructed as fighting with their partners, while Indo-Guyanese women were recorded as having experienced violence against women. Similar observations were made by Bryce Baker in research with African, Caribbean, and African American women in the US, and in more recent research by Erin O'Neill and Laura Beckman with African American and Latina women in the US. These researchers all found that Black and Latina women were constructed as strong Black and brown emasculating matriarchs who were fighting with their partners, were the cause of the violence perpetrated against them, and did not require state support. Such contrasting constructions of Black and brown women in the US and the Caribbean and Indo-Caribbean women are found to be equally harmful, with the latter being constructed as perpetual victims in need of rescue, and the former regarded as responsible for their own experience of harm in the context of intimate relationships. As Saidia Hartman has argued, sexual and other manifestations of gendered violence against enslaved Black women in the US was sanctioned in the dominant racist and gendered objectification of Black women as sexually loose. Both in the US and in the Caribbean, the common law provisions on sexual violence did not include enslaved women. In the case of the British Caribbean, enslaved persons' legal status as chattel denied them most common law protections. Historical antecedents become necessary to consider in the making of the structural and institutional context of gendered harms to which most women are exposed. Reflecting on the pervasiveness of various manifestations of gendered violence in Africa, Amina Mama calls on us to engage both historical and contemporary analyses. Mama writes, and I quote, "The collective African experience, being conquered by the colonizing powers, being culturally and materially subjected to 19th century European racial hierarchy and its gender politics, being indoctrinated into all-male European administrative systems, and facing the continuous flow of material and human resources from Africa to Europe, has persistently affected all aspects of social, cultural, political, and economic life in post-colonial African states." Analyses offered in the work of Caribbean women's organizations like Sistren Theatre Collective and Red Thread, Sistren Theatre Collective out of Jamaica and Red Thread out of Guyana, also make visible the connections between gendered violence in the context of intimate relationships and in families, as well as these broader histories of violence. In addition, Senior in her poetry makes visible the amplified levels of violence and entrapment women in violent relationships continue to suffer during the current health crisis and the attendant mitigation measures in the form of lockdowns. State responses in the region to mitigating these harms remain insufficient, given the absence of a critical gender responsive action across the board, and especially in times of crisis. This remains a key barrier in how our society's attempts at addressing social transformation occurs. Over the years, in my analysis of the gender narratives of violence, I have observed that gendered assumptions are frequently mobilized in interviews. Colonialist scripting of gender tends to dominate in accounts of men in particular, as they talk about violence. These are repeated in media scripts as well as in interventions by public figures. Across my research in the region, and I'm summarizing here, happy to go into this if we have an opportunity in greater detail in the question and answer, I have found that, paradoxically, men often assert themselves as proficient in their use of violence against women, while also insisting that they are in fact nonviolent. When women engage in violent acts, these are trivialized by men as ineffective. This insight reveals the taken for granted gender notions of men as adept in the use of violence when compared to their partners. For example, men discuss their violence as a means to which to restore or reassert their dominance in the face of challenges to conventional gendered arrangements. Several men distance themselves from the acts of violence they engage through silence, denial, and avoidance. This has to do with how men perform and manage public expressions of self, particularly in interviews with researchers. They avoid implicating themselves as responsible for said violence and often describe themselves as essentially, as I said before, nonviolent. And this all over the course of a single interview. Violent acts engaged by men are rationalized as strategic responses to women's recalcitrance or disobedience. In asserting their identity as men, they often articulate expectations of deference by women. Narratives of gendered provocation and blame are invoked by men who perpetrate violence by law enforcement and by members of the legal profession. I also found that love and violence are often presented as incompatible in both women and men's accounts, pointing to notions of love as enduring and as that force which provides a basis upon which to overcome any conflict or violence. And lastly, I want to highlight expectations of women's domesticity and fidelity are frequently invoked by men to explain violence. At the level of the intimate relationship, there is the naturalization of care as women's work in ways that create violent outcomes for women when men deem women to have reneged on their responsibility, that is their domestic responsibility. In the following example, for example, an interview participant from St. Vincent and the Grenadines, who I'm referring to, as Floyd rationalized his violence in the following way. I said to her, don't watch it. I come home, nothing to eat. What I mean, like, okay, she just started to cook because everything is just the movie. So I started to make noise. And this is the thing. Every time you start to make noise with her, she's always the first to square up at you. And I lash her. And she is the kind of person when you lash and tell her, listen, she doesn't stop. She feels just, she must get her revenge. Floyd's account provides a pathway for us to think about how violence, unpaid labor, and care are interconnected, not only at the level of the relationship, but also in how women navigate familial, societal, and global relations of power. Taking care of households, taking care of children, catering to men's physical, emotional, and sexual needs are often presented by men who perpetrate violence as ways in which women are required to function in families and relationships. In the interview with Floyd, he explained that a reasonable woman would return straight home. That a reasonable woman would return straight home after work to ensure her partner's evening meal is prepared, instead of spending time with her family of origin. This became the central rationalization for his violence. I suggest here that given the widespread ways in which these multiple registers of femininity circulate and shape both familial and extrafamilial relationships, women's autonomy, particularly women who experience violence, are especially circumscribed. And with this, I turn to unpaid labor and the complex of care. Work, paid and unpaid, and care are significantly imbricated or intertwined in the lives of Caribbean women. Merle Hodges' reminder that Caribbean women have always navigated the multiple forms of work, Rhoda Reddock's interrogation of the sexual division of labor in Caribbean women's histories of work, the late Andai's activist scholarship on the enormous price for women of their unwaged work, and how this continues to underwrite the global economy, and global networks of socialist feminist analysis and activism all point to the enduring gendered inequalities which women experience as we navigate labor and care. In any given society, labor markets, the economy, and the state's capacity to reproduce itself and its institutions remain deeply connected to and reliant on women's reproductive capacity, as well as women's care and household activities. Globally, women spend between 2 and 10 times more than men on unpaid labor and care, as this graph that I'm now sharing with you shows. An examination of data from the Living Conditions in Grenada Poverty and Equity 2021 World Bank report revealed that on average, a higher proportion of poor households are female-headed compared to non-poor households. There is, in fact, a difference of nearly 12 percentage points in the proportion of female-headed households across poor and non-poor households. In terms of household heads' educational attainment, not surprisingly, non-poor household heads have higher primary and tertiary education. And here is a table that demonstrates how this plays out in the context of Grenada. So we see there, in terms of female-headed households, about over half of female-headed households are in the category of poor. And we see here that, you know, it's slightly lower for men, just under 50% for men. And as the table shows, you see how this lines up with level of education for both poor and non-poor households. What do these data reveal about the connection between socioeconomic conditions and women's engagement in paid and unpaid labor, as well as care activities? For one, even though women's unpaid labor and care activities sustain families, societies, and economies, a tendency to invisibilize, undervalue, and neglect this contribution is in much of economic, political, sociocultural, historical, and policy analyses is even more harmful for women heads of households who tend to be poorer and less likely to access sustainable livelihoods in Caribbean labor markets. In addition, as was previously noted, women's unpaid labor and care activities increase significantly in times of crises, as we have seen with the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic. In times of natural disasters, during which women and children are far more likely to be displaced as a consequence of climate change, in the face of food insecurity, and as countries confront economic precarity. In other words, the uneven burden of care and unpaid labor is even more acute for economically disadvantaged women. Further, colonial, neocolonial, and neoliberal extractivist global regimes serve to amplify the exploitation of women's unpaid labor. As Gertrude Zeifer-Torviki demonstrates in her analysis of the experiences of rural women farmers in Ghana. Torviki shows how these women resist the exploitation of their labor by large agro-industrial processing companies, making clear their desire to be landowners in ways that facilitate their subsistence and their engagement in familial care. Considering as well how gender notions of care materialize in Caribbean law, Tracy Robinson notes that the care required to sustain human existence remains privatized, feminized, and undervalued. She cites both ruptures and continuities in the legal codification of care. For example, with the introduction of the 1998 Trinidad and Tobago Cohabitational Relationships Act, some judges ruled with an appreciation that financial contributions and emotional and physical care are inextricably connected. Under this act in Trinidad and Tobago, Superior Court judges, according to Robinson, have attempted to translate how caregiving activities should be counted and valued in court settlements, in much the same way that paid work accords a direct monetary value. However, this logic is inconsistently applied across different jurisdictions in the region, given the variations in legislation from one country to another, and differences in how care and unpaid labor is valued and or devalued across member states. Caribbean feminists have also demonstrated the contribution of the late 20th century Wages for Housework campaign, as well as the transnational feminist drive to have states quantify the often invisibilized unpaid labor and care activities which women disproportionately undertake and which continue to militate against women's ability to live fully autonomous lives. Underpinning the organization of work and care in women's lives is an ideological gender division of women's private unpaid household care activities on the one hand, and a masculinized public paid labor on the other. In the context of historical and contemporary forms of capitalism, neoliberal globalization, this produces materially uneven and disadvantageous outcomes for women and girls in particular. Andai has called for the need to measure women's unwage or what she calls care work as a key pillar of economies over time, which becomes even more onerous and exploitative for women coping with, for example, militarism and war, natural disasters, massive migrations, and intolerable debt. And those are the areas highlighted in Andai's analysis. Health, economic, ecological, and climate crises combine to form another in a series of inflection points in the Caribbean, for which the potency of Andai's analysis can be observed, applied, and complicated. The enduring feature of her contribution is a deep and abiding quest to change unequal structural arrangements based on race, class, and gender, which produce violence and various other harms in the lives of the majority of Caribbean people in general, and Caribbean women specifically. In this sense, structural and historical arrangements figure in how gendered and gendered inequalities create material harms in the lives of women. I connect the uneven burden of care and violence as these are felt experiences that are in fact buttressed by a political economy that thrives on reproducing exploitative conditions for women and the most economically disadvantaged among us. Andai's theorizing and practice converges around a Marxist analysis of capitalism and class, a Caribbean intellectual tradition which centers race settler colonialism, or what she calls race capitalism, as key to the making of the Caribbean and to feminist analysis of gender, all of which are combined in unpacking women's experiences with unpaid labor, care, and violence. The advocacy to quantify women's care activities and women's unpaid labor in the form of housework, care for children, the infirm, the elderly, and adult men, remains a critical dimension of Caribbean and transnational feminist analysis and advocacy, from Red Thread's time-use surveys in Guyana to regional calls by feminists in the 1980s and 90s for Caribbean states to quantify unpaid labor and women's care activities. The Caribbean, through its feminist activist intellectuals, placed the issue as one central to the pursuit of gender justice. In 2021, it was reported that Grenada is among 4 Eastern Caribbean countries that will pilot a survey to measure what they term unpaid care as part of its national census. This work is currently underway and is regarded as a necessary step to assessing women's contribution to socioeconomic development. It builds on a history of collaboration among Caribbean and transnational feminist organizing on women's labor, Caribbean governments' expressed commitment to gender equality, and the role of international development agencies like UN Women in delivering on their mandate to achieve gender equality and the empowerment of women. It also builds on the path-breaking research from the Women in the Caribbean project led by Professor Jocelyn Messiah, which quantified and qualified Caribbean working class women's engagement with unpaid labor, care, paid work, and their experiences of violence. This research was instrumental in complicating one-dimensional accounts of women's reproductive and productive activities. It avoided a bifurcation of gender, or a sort of dichotomous or binary way of reading gender, by exposing the complexities of Black and brown women's engagement in work and care historically. For example, the gendered organization of work in the French Caribbean. In examining the gendered organization of work in the French Caribbean, Bernard Moit detailed how women performed disproportionately more hard labor than men in the fields. In fact, women made up the majority of forced laborers in field gangs, whose members did the bulk of the arduous labor. The economic ability of plantations, according to Moit, the economic viability of plantations, according to Moit, depended significantly on women's labor. Similarly, Nicole Phillips Dow has demonstrated how enslaved women in Grenada, as was the case in other European colonies under the plantation system, were required to assume the double burden of production and reproduction with little to no differentiation in how they participated in labor-intensive tasks in the fields when compared to enslaved Black men. She goes on to explain that this in many ways undermined a European gender logic of women as the so-called weaker sex. Enslaved Black women also functioned as nurses and midwives, carers for children of white planters, performed domestic labor in and around the plantation house, and were made to function as hucksters selling charcoal, fruits, and vegetables for their white enslavers. Artisanal work was performed exclusively by men. These historical accounts reveal the ways in which race overdetermined and continues to animate the operation of gender relations, systems, and societies in post-colony plantation societies. Doing gender justice work in the region is also doing contextual work. It requires that we remain attentive to the racialized and gendered history of labor exploitation and how, as Lamin has urged, these shape our consciousness, social arrangements, and material realities. Turning more specifically to the complex of care, feminists have long theorized care in terms of its economic value in underwriting entire economies, hence references to the care economy and care work. However, I suggest a shift in thinking about the gendered logics of unpaid labor and care beyond a focus on measuring their contribution to the economy, as has been done in much of feminist class analysis. I do so for two reasons. The first is that the binary organization of work and care misses the several vehicles through which naturalized logics about relations of gender figure prominently. Let me reread that. The first is that the binary organization of work and care misses the several vehicles through which naturalized logics about relations of gender figure prominently in the organization and material outcomes of work within so-called public labor markets. Here, I think about how the sexual division of labor translates into either lower-level service-related jobs in tourism or retail businesses, or in fields like nursing. Rhoda Reddock has shown how when women begin to occupy areas of the labor market in large numbers, there is a commensurate devaluing which occurs. Drawing on historical analysis of the teaching profession in the Caribbean, Reddock demonstrates how a different set of values become attached to teaching with an influx of women to the profession and a subsequent decline in the number of men by the second half of the 20th century in the Caribbean. It is at this point that the gendered logics of care begin to accompany expectations of female teachers. Gendered class and respectability politics around marriage, childbearing, and sexual conservatism would dominate how female teachers were required to operate within the profession. For example, in this early period, pregnant women could lose their employment in teaching. Later, this rule was relaxed to permit married women to continue in the profession. The violence of colonial and post-colonial Caribbean states must be named and confronted for how gendered notions of care and women's unpaid labor are mobilized in ways that disadvantage women. Pursuing gender justice thus involves exposing and unraveling these racialized and patriarchal formations. The second reason for a focus on women's engagement in care activities beyond measuring its economic value is grounded in women's own framing of unpaid labor and care in ways that simultaneously collapses and separates the two. In other words, as Danielle Bob has shown in her interviews with women, care and household activities are defined by women as inhering both economic and affective value. And by the affective here, I refer to the feeling, the emotion behind who we are and how we come into being. The affective shows up in all of who we are. It is not to be separated from the instrumental functions that we perform as part of our living. The tasks that women perform are both imbued with affect and efficacy or function across a continuum. It is for this reason that I take seriously Bob's suggestion that we consider the multiple implications of work. She calls for a rethinking of feminist frameworks which seek to address the devaluing of women's unwaged labor by, and I quote, inserting women's domestic activities into patriarchal and capitalist valuing of work with the belief that it will be empowering for women, end of quote. Theorizing work beyond economic valuing of specific activities eschews a purely Marxist political economy of work in favor of more nuanced analysis grounded in the experiences and theorizing provided by women themselves about their own lives. It calls on us to take seriously the joys and complications that care creates in the lives of women. In delineating the complexities of care, which inhere in women's lives, it becomes necessary to return to the very bifurcation of gender, which takes hold in much of Western philosophical thought and practice. Specifically, how oppositional accounts of a rational, autonomous man and a dependent, caring woman take hold. A paradox emerges. On the one hand, care is visibly naturalized as the preserve of women. On the other hand, there is a relative invisibility and mystification of the activities assigned and or engaged by women as care. And this has the effect of creating uneven outcome for large groups of women who are expected to care. If naturalized as work or activities for which women are inherently expected to engage, then it reduces any requirement by men to be proficient at care. To clarify, I am not at all suggesting that men do not have the capacity for, nor that men do not in fact engage in care. In much the same way that Eugene Barito argues that gender is often masked as natural and normal in how we ideologically assign separate roles to women and men, I suggest that the ideologies underpinning care function to create the conditions in which men are not expected to be proficient at care, so that when they are, this is celebrated as additional, cited as appendage to men's identity, or as attempts by men to assist women, but not necessarily central to how men come into understandings of themselves. Conversely, the assumption that care activities normally associated with women would become imbued with greater value is undermined. But the assumption that if men engage the traditional activities that are associated with care that we assign to women, that somehow when men do them, they would become imbued with greater value, is undermined by patterns of male domination and leadership emerging in professions conventionally conceived as an extension of women's care. For example, consider the ways in which men become administrators at a faster rate when they enter professions in healthcare. Bob also observed that even as women construct their maternal and worker subjectivity in oppositional ways, women's so-called naturalized care attributes are co-opted in the public paid labor force in service of what she calls a feminized neoliberal worker identity. In other words, in intimate and familial relationships, as well as in the public paid labor force, feminized care is rendered as both natural and necessary activities and work to be engaged by women. It goes without saying that human experience requires care from others. But as Barito has argued, often women enter heterosexual relationships in search of erotic ecstasy, care, love, and affection, but such desires are often surrendered or replaced with care as labor, as opposed to mutual care as love. In other words, when care is reduced to work, it distorts, undervalues, and limits the possibilities for engaging care as empowering. The disruptions in gendered notions of care function to create violent outcomes for women in the context of patriarchal, intimate relations. It is here that it also becomes necessary to expand beyond a rendering of care as labor or as commodity, or even care as emotion work. In the context of gendered violence against women in intimate relationships and in the family, we see how gendered care becomes mobilized to rationalize, to justify, and to excuse these harms against women. The pursuit of gender justice requires that we celebrate care as that which sustains and is to be sustained, as that which nourishes and which ought to be nourished, as that which enriches us as individuals and our communities. Care should never be mobilized as a bulwark for gendered violence, of the gendered violence of the state, for capitalist and neoliberal accumulation, or in interpersonal relationships to explain violence. As I conclude, I wish to underscore the urgent need to delink care from these colonialist scripting of gender if we are to achieve the kind of material changes necessary for meaningful transformation. The immense contribution of feminists toward an economic valuing of women's paid work and care should not be lost. However, addressing the taken for granted ways in which care and unpaid domestic labor is devalued as women's work, and their centrality to how women are engaged in their relations with the state, in families, in relationships, in communities, and in the global political economy must feature as part of our ongoing project of decolonization. This must be driven from within. A reconfigured engagement on questions of justice, equity, and equality that takes account of the complex of gender violence, unpaid labor, and care should feature in how we create and implement policies and legislation, in how law enforcement engages women and children who report gendered violence, in how we consider shifts in the labor market, and in how states and societies, as well as communities, relate to women. Care must be rendered for the potential it houses in eliminating violence. Its potential to heal and empower must be tapped as an infinite resource for personal, familial, and collective social transformation. For women, uprooting the gender distortions of care remain critical. Returning to senior, we are reminded of how alarmingly more acute these distortions and dangers have become for women in a health crisis. That metaphor of gasping for breath, with its equally literal manifestation as we continue to record deaths of women to intimate partner homicide. The uncertainty of escape when one's exit is blocked, as senior writes. If there be no other reason for us to apprehend gender justice, let us at least commit to life and living over death. Our measure of progress is not that we've survived histories of violence and dispossession, but that we uproot the mechanisms of power that permit a just Caribbean liberty. Peace and blessings, and thank you for listening.
Dr. Deshong, I think I would have to quote Mr. Lawrence when he spoke about scholastic marksmanship, and I think you have done that justice this evening. We want to sincerely thank you for the lecture, for the exposition on a lot of topics that we don't talk about. Sometimes we feel very uncomfortable talking about, but that needs to be spoken about. I'm happy that there are some young folks in the audience here today, children from secondary schools and from the T.A. Marisha Community College. We want to thank you sincerely, and we want to open the floor for a few questions. So I will pass over to my colleague. We are sending the questions. Mrs. Keisha Comijong Branch is our program officer in Grenada, and she has been looking at the chat and seeing all of the questions. So she's going to ask you those questions now. I have some myself, so I'll give her as well. So we just open the mic for questions. If there's anyone, any of the young people who have a question, don't be shy. We can start with you, and then we can go to the other ones. Young people?
Good evening, everyone. The first question, would you say that even today, women are not seen or treated as full citizens?
Just thank you for the question. Just to be clear, do you prefer me to take a group, or do you want me to respond one by one?
You can respond to that one.
Okay, thank you. I didn't get your name, but thank you for your question. And I would say yours is a big question. It's the stuff of, I think, an entire series, not just a lecture. I would say the point I was trying to make today is, notwithstanding how your question today, even today, are women, I missed the full citizens. I would say I can answer this by thinking about how, if I take a review of how women are positioned in policies, law, if I take a view of the state in particular, there are ways in which Caribbean states have functioned or worked to redress a lot of historical inequalities through the work of feminist organizations throughout the region, mobilizing for change, through Caribbean government's commitments to a number of international treaties, but notwithstanding those expressions or an explicit statement in some instances by Caribbean government, there's so many ways in which full citizenship continue to be denied. If we take, for instance, the question of migration status, and how it still remains in a few Caribbean countries, Bahamas included, where citizenship cannot be passed on from a woman who is legally married to a man who is non-Bahamian. But the reverse is true. And that was very much so the law for a very long time. And it tells us something about how Caribbean states read women. They read women in relation to their relationship status, in relation to, as Michelle Rowley says to us, in terms of them as maternal subjects, so the capacity to reproduce. But there are many ways in which women are unable to access the same kinds of protection and rights as men. And some of this is in terms of enshrined in our Caribbean constitutions, but at the level of law, it is still the case. Gender-based violence, in my view, is a key measure by which we can pose questions about women's citizenship. The extent to which this happens in the context of families, at the level of the state where insufficient protections remain, at the level of policy and at the level of action. So we have done a lot by way of, and through again the advocacy and work of Caribbean feminists organizing, we have done a lot by way of legislating, creating a Domestic Violence Act, revising our sexual offenses legislation. But when you see the reports, especially in some of the research I have done, of the inconsistent ways in which law enforcement, for instance, engage women who report gendered violence, it tells us something about the extent to which policies and laws and practice, there is this disconnect. So I would say there are too many examples to suggest that women are rendered full citizens in the Caribbean. By the same token, however, none of this was an attempt to construct Caribbean women as always already victims, as inherently victims. By no means. This is actually an attempt by me to show the ways in which unequal relations of power continue to animate the lives of Caribbean women, notwithstanding our capacity to assert autonomy, our capacity to live, and our practice, I would say, to live autonomous lives. There are still too many instances at the level of law, at the level of policy, at the level of practice that delimit the question of citizenship. And I do think there's a lot of really great Caribbean work that looks to actually unpick questions of citizenship and how gender and sexuality in particular, and class, continue to be ways in which too many people in our region are marginalized and subjected to inequality. So my short answer is no, and my long answer is there is a body of Caribbean work that analyzing the ways in which women's citizenship continues to be circumscribed in the region.
Thank you, Dr. Deshong. I have one question from an anonymous person. The corporate culture is evolving with significant disparities in the way that women are treated and paid. It is somewhat of a pseudo-equality. What strategies would you recommend should be employed to break the proverbial glass ceiling?
I didn't hear the first part of the question. I'm just struggling to hear a little bit on my side.
The corporate culture is evolving with significant disparities in the way that women are treated and paid. It is somewhat of a pseudo-quality. What strategies would you recommend should be employed to break the proverbial glass ceiling?
Right. I heard pseudo-equality and the suggestion that the corporate culture is evolving and the strategies necessary to break the proverbial glass ceiling.
Yes, right. That's right.
So for me, I think it's important to situate corporate culture within broader systems of power that produce said culture. I think it's important for us to understand how women are located in this space and how the location of women become complicated by their reality of class, the realities of race, and the realities of gender. So for instance, one of the things that we talk about quite a bit, and she's right to suggest that in many ways, the private sector, the boardrooms are by and large, the top seats of power, especially in the private sector, are still largely male dominated. And this has serious implications for women's economic empowerment. However, the domination is not only by gender, but a particular class of men. So, I have colleagues here who do work on, business history like Dr. Carter and merchant capital like Don Marshall. And in their work, they trace the ways in which, historically, if you look at where money tends to be concentrated, you will see both class and gendered inequality. And in some ways, that is also racialized. So I think situating corporate culture in that broader history, but also thinking about the ways in which what exactly is militating against women's ability to access these spaces. And when women do access these spaces, what might it mean for transformation, or what might it not mean for transformation? For me, I've not done research in that area, but I would say it really becomes necessary to situate corporate culture within larger structures, within larger economic and social structures. Because I think we will begin to see how we must kind of do our analysis by both gender and class for thinking through who has access and who might be denied access. A lot of work has been done recently to look at the extent to which women are prevented. There are serious barriers to women being able to access credit and finance in terms of their entrepreneurial pursuits, right? And so when we talk about economic empowerment and economic emancipation within Caribbean society, it becomes necessary for us to think, for instance, about the ways in which banks do business. I have to say, I meant to say thank you to Mr. Lawrence for being as manager and director of the Grenada Cooperative Bank, for sponsoring this lecture, but also that you have something, you have an entity called Grenada Cooperative Bank that is of Grenada and of Grenadians. I think those spaces provide possibilities for us to shape the kind of business culture, the kind of corporate culture we expect to see. Because where government can make changes as it relates to the public sector, they're more hard-pressed to make those kind of changes in the corporate sector. So where we spend our money is with whom we do business matters, and it should send a signal as consumers. We are more than 50%, and that should tell us something about the power that we might have to mobilize. And I say this with a great appreciation for the operation of power and capitalism, and how global capital flow functions. I think there's a lot of hard work to do. I would say read the work of Camille This is, I think Professor Barito is here, but Professor Barito's student who's done quite a bit, former student who is now the registrar of University of Trinidad and Tobago. I'm forgetting Dr. Camille's surname, but she's done quite a bit of work on leadership and what this means in terms of women's ability to access those kinds of spaces.
Thank you. In your research, or in your opinion, how far does race still affect gender relations in the Caribbean today?
How far does race still race?
Yes.
I think the point I make about race here and in my work more expansively is that race, our gendered relations are in fact saturated by race, and it is by design, by history, by definition. And the example I like to use to illustrate this is how oftentimes we continue to be, to pledge allegiance to these gender systems and structures that were never invented with us in mind in the first place. We continue to be committed to these conventional notions of gender. And when we consider these conventional notions of gender, like for instance, how under Victorian ideology, you had some notion of a middle-class public husband who goes out to look after his family, and a middle-class private wife who stays at home. That was in and of itself a fiction for European society, for English society, that we somehow continue to allow to shape our ideas about gender, even though our Caribbean reality has never materially been that. So we could think about the labor exploitation of indigenous people in the region. We could think about the exploitation of African enslaved persons in the region. The fact that when we arrived and when Indo-Caribbean women arrived, we all arrived as labor. We never arrived to be anybody's housewives. It explains why after the Quakers attempted to set up these peasant societies in Grenada, in Jamaica, sorry, where they afforded land to formerly enslaved Afro-Caribbean families with some intention that it would save women from agricultural hard labor and their so-called husbands will go out to work. They could not understand why, after having set up these free villages, as they were termed then, that women insisted in engaging in agricultural production. And that is a tradition that was carried over from their experience as West Africans. So these ideologies of gender that continue to control and animate how we think about what it means to be a woman, a man, or a gender expansive person. These ideologies of gender never matched our material reality, as those our ancestors showed, that they continued to be tied to the land, right? And they continued, Merle Hodges' refrain that Caribbean women have always worked tells us something about the fiction of a private woman and a public man. And she means, by that she was referring to how women have worked. Having said that, however, this does not mean that Caribbean women have always accessed work, particularly in the public paid labor force, at the same levels and with the same level of remuneration as have Caribbean men. And this is, of course, complexed by class in terms of the labor market. So I use that as an example to say that race, in my view, race over-determines gender relations in the region. Race animates gender relations in the region. And it's very difficult to talk about race on the one hand and gender on the other, because they intersect in fundamental ways. So it's very much so present in how we do gender analysis and feminist work in the region.
Thank you. I have last question. How do we change mindsets in Caribbean society towards gender violence and unpaid labor?
Thank you for that question. It's a really important question. And I would say this. I would like us to open our thinking and our doing to the immense body of work, action, thinking that have been done within Caribbean feminist spaces, whether it's Caribbean feminist organizing, which also is Caribbean feminist intellectual work, because in those spaces, you find a wealth of available possibilities for a different kind of Caribbean, for more just Caribbean. And I say this because a lot of early Caribbean feminist organizing was about public education. You think about the work of CAFRA in the region and the work that they did with police officers across the region to sort of educate them about addressing gendered violence. We have the intellectual and wherewithal. We need the political will to line up with that. I must say that there are so many wonderful initiatives being undertaken within Grenada to seek to address gendered violence, from the policy that exists, from the kind of overarching plan which exists, and the fact that work has to be continued to be funded. But I would say that we should not take for granted the importance of reinforcing, the importance of working with young people, you know, at the level of education. St. Vincent and the Grenadines recently redesigned an HFLE curriculum for its technical and vocational schools, where it did not exist before. And with the support of the Caribbean Development Bank, they actually ensured that education and action on gender, what is gender, what do we mean by gender, and its relationship to gender-based violence, as well as a redesign of the kind of education around sex and sexuality for those young adults who go to the technical and vocational schools throughout St. Vincent and the Grenadines. Those kinds of initiatives should not be one-off, and that currently existing in the region are these action plans, some of which are very well, I would say, resourced, but the majority of them are not. And to me, that's a huge plank of the work, but the work needs to happen at so many levels, at the level of the community, at the level of families, at the level of the state, at the level of, you know, the fact that we have Caribbean ways of doing, like Walter Rodney's notion of grounding, right? We need to return to those ways of doing and thinking, but when we return to them, we need to return to them with different possibilities imagined. And so I would say public education, what we put out there in media matters. It matters that we hold media accountable for the kind of messages that are circulated. Media and I see sometimes in work I've done with Dr. Tanya Haynes, when we ask media, persons who work in media, why do they report on gendered violence in the way that they do, in some very kind of harm-producing ways? They say we are simply reporting what we receive from courts, right? But that is not the case. In our analysis, we found that there are many ways in which they sensationalize, but they reproduce some very harmful assumptions, and they trivialize what are felt experiences, particularly for women and children. So I would say that the work is plenty, manifold, and must be, it requires people to be committed. It requires states to be committed. It requires political will. And it must be ongoing. We must be relentless.
Dr. Deshong, we said that was the last question, but we have a student here who would like to ask you a question. So I would like you to stand and ask your question, please. Here's the mic.
Thank you. Good night. The question I wanted to ask was, do you think the governments in the Caribbean should start giving access or grants to women that do housework or stay at home and they do most of the work in the house? Do you think they should start giving grants to the women to help build their families?
Thank you for that very tough question, but a very good question. And it's a question that has occupied feminists for quite some time. And it's a question that was at the center of the Wages for Housework campaign. I think before we even get to whether government should give grants to women for housework, that we need to think about democratizing housework and care. And I do think there's a way in which states and communities have to figure out how we approach valuing care work, because there's a monetary value to be attached that I think has been the intention of the Wages for Housework campaign. But I also want us to think about the ways that we may not want to reduce in economic ways, the whole push to household. I think that we could think about a reorganized, a reoriented labor market that better reflects the organization of work and care in our societies. And I think we have to work at different purposes. For instance, the question of childcare. Childcare, by and large, falls to women in households. And this is not to suggest that men don't take care of children, right? But what about if we had better ways for thinking about who should care for children? Because if we consider that the majority of women who are caring are also engaged in paid employment, that for the majority of families, you actually need how our societies are organized by class and socioeconomic circumstances. Most households require its adult members to work. And once work is available, those adult members will engage in, when I say work, sorry, I mean paid work. So then where should the responsibility for care lie? And that, I think, is a larger question we need to really answer, that there needs to be more support for the care of children. There needs to be, in order to allow for the democratizing of care. I think the large point I was trying to make is that we need to delink care as exclusively women's work, and by extension, work that or exclusively women's activities, and by extension, a devaluing of said care. So for me, there has to be a way in which we reorient the question of trying to place a monetary value on care, but rather how we reorient care as something for which we are all responsible. And then we could talk about some questions around its economic value, something we do not do in the region. If we want to attach an economic value to unpaid labor, how does it appear in our things like budgets, or how we measure GDP, etc. So for me, before we get to assigning monetary value and passing this on to households, there are other things we can do as states to democratize care, would be my answer. And thanks for that very hard question. A very thoughtful student you have there, Dr. Philip Doe.
Dr. Deshong, we want to say thank you. Our sincerest thank yous for your delivery of this year's lecture. We want to say thank you again to Grenada Cooperative Bank for sponsoring the lecture again this year. And we want to say thank you for our small audience that we had here this evening. Thank you for Dr. Charmaine Christopher for saying the opening prayer for us. Thank you to Westmoreland and T.A. Marisha Community College for coming out. And thank you to our Westmoreland son, Ojas. Thank you for your question. That's the thought-provoking question that you just got a while ago. Thank you to Dr. Grenada. I know that she's there. Thank you so much for leading me in the direction to Dr. Deshong. And thank you so much for always supporting us in things like these. So ladies and gentlemen, those of you who are listening to us online, we want to say sincere thank you for joining us this evening, and we do look forward to seeing you again next year around the same time for the 8th annual Carol Bristol Distinguished Lecture Series. Once again, thank you very much and good night.
Good night. Thank you all as well. Good night.